Inside the Lords this week, there's been a lot of understandable outrage about the infected blood scandal. And at the same time, we've got the Post Office and the Post Masters scandal carrying on, with Paula Venables at the inquiry today as I'm filming this, and the cover-up at the Post Office is a big issue. It does feel at times as though everything's a scandal, and that you have to kind of wait for many, many years to discover what the establishment have done to cover up the fact that they've treated ordinary people with contempt. I myself have been discussing what's happening in prisons, and this is a scandal, in my opinion, that might not affect the mass of the public, but nonetheless should be outraging the public. And so I just want to talk a little bit about it. Now, this week, we have got ourselves into a situation in which the government has, in the papers today, it says the government have instructed the police not to arrest as many people because there isn't room for them in prison. We're in a situation in which a conservative pro-law and order party, the Conservative government, are basically orchestrating an early release scheme from prison for what arguably could be quite dangerous, or prisoners who are being let out 70 days early. Although, to be fair, they will be on almost house arrest for the 70 days, but nonetheless they're getting kicked out of jail. But additional to that, there's been instructions given that even when people are prosecuted, a whole range of offences now will not lead to prison time. This is not because anybody's having is walking around thinking, let's be soft on law and order. This is because of the mismanagement of prisons by the government. Not just the government, but the Labour Party when it was in government. The whole issue about prisons, what they're for, whether they can possibly deal with the increased numbers who are being incarcerated in them. You can be as hardline as you want on law and order, but if you have got a situation in which prisons are festering, places that are likely to lead to people leaving prison and becoming more criminal than they were when they went in, this is failure of the job. You need some element of rehabilitation as well as punishment. And the places are a cauldron, and there's, everybody predicting that there's going to be an explosion of riots. There's people in one prison, HMP Park in South Wales. I think 9 prisoners have died in 8 weeks, probably due to a bad spice, a drug being used. This is cruel and barbaric. So I have taken the opportunity of being in the House of Lords, being part of the great and the good, to do something about prison reform, because I think it's very important. In the issue that I have been going on about, you would have heard me speak, I was on my final attempt at defending those prisoners who were on imprisoned for public protection sentences, a sentence which is an indefinite 99-year sentence, that even if you get out, you are on a licence which is easily triggered to drag you back into prison, and is also 99 years, and this can be for relatively low-level crime. There's 3,000 people who are on IPPs at the moment. You might think, I don't care about that, it's only prisoners. But we've got to remember, this is the British state. The British state brought this sentence in, and guess what? It was so bad that they abolished it in 2012. And yet it still remains. And I've written about this, and we've talked about it before. An interesting behind-the-scenes bit of scandal erupted this time. My more radical proposal for resentencing was dumped at committee stage. We're back at report when you can vote. And there's been great efforts made to ensure that the amendments would be practical and helpful for those prisoners who remain, or those on IPP sentences. And the Labour Party had promised at the dispatch box that they would look at one particularly important amendment, which was put forward by Daniel Moylan, which is to reverse the parole test, so that when you are in prison on one of these IPPs, you go to the parole board. At the moment, the onus is on the prisoner to prove they're safe, rather than on the parole board to prove that you're dangerous. And the problem is the prison, it's impossible to prove you're safe. But anyway, in order to prove you're safe, you have to say you've been on a number of courses which have been cancelled by the prison you're in. So what can you do? The whole thing is a fix. And I think that giving the power to the state to incarcerate people for decades after they've done their time is something every single member of the British public should care about. So when the Labour Party at committee said that they were going to support Lord Moylan's amendment, and they'd look at it again, or they were supportive, that gave great hope to IPP grassroots campaigners and a lot of people in the Labour Party who were of a prison reform disposition were pleased. This week, the mood music changed. A couple of things happened. At PMQs, when Rishi Sunak was questioned about early release schemes from prisoners, up pops Keir Starmer saying, it's a disgrace, these prisoners should never be let out. You know, in other words, wanted to prove that they were the hardline law and order party. And rather than taking the opportunity of being able to release 3,000 people who shouldn't be in prison, which might free up some prison places, instead, the Labour front bench in the Lords, who had, as we said, offered some hope, suddenly started cancelling meetings and not turning up. I noticed that the front bench Labour Lord scurried past me and wouldn't catch my eye, was cancelling meetings with people like Lord Moylan. He'd organised a meeting with even some trade unions who were involved in wanting these IPP sentences sorting out. And yesterday they did their damnedest and they basically said that they would abstain from the main amendment that would help with the reverse test. Because people in the Lords, you know, there's all this kind of intrigue going on, because they got wind of this, there was a compromise amendment. A compromise amendment would not reverse the burden of proof test, but would just give some hope for people at that parole process. That was a compromise designed for the Labour Party to be able to vote without being accused in a pre-election year of being soft on law and order. Guess what? The Labour Party decided to abstain on the compromise amendment. And I was really pleased that the person who put that amendment forward, Lord Thomas of Cumgeath, who is a former law lord, who spoke brilliantly well on the great injustice of the state being given such powers and abusing them in the way that they have, he actually said he'd call a vote. And so the Labour Party sat on their hands during that vote. Now I say that to you because even if you don't care about prisoners, one thing you should care about is the Labour Party are unlikely to get elected at the next election. It's important that we know what they believe in and what they stand for. What we can't have is a situation where they basically lack courage if they think it might play badly at a particular time. Maybe they are going to come back and help IPP prisoners when they get elected. But we should know that, shouldn't we? They shouldn't be U-turning on every single promise that they've made. And there's been a lot of these U-turns. And I think that it does indicate a real moral rot at the heart of the Labour Party that they would behave like that. Of course, I'm not giving the government an easy pass, by the way, because the government are the ones who have been utterly cowardly on this issue. But nonetheless, the Labour Party like to pretend that they're on the side of social justice, but when it comes to the crunch, they'll run a mile. I also just want to point out that this is a total insult to the public, because the assumption is always that the public will not be able to understand the complexities of something like IPP prison sentences and will never understand something that could give fair play to people as scummy as prisoners. That's the way they all think the public are like. And I know that the public are not like that at all. And it was great that I was on GB News during the week, and Michelle Dewberry, who's one of those lock them up and throw away the key people, on her own admission, said that even though she is hardline on law and order, she could see that IPPs was a great disgrace and a stain on the justice system. So that's me ranting on about that. While I'm on GB News, another thing that I want to note is that Ofcom have ruled against the GB News edition of Rishi Sunak talking to the public. This is significant for the Lords because the head of Ofcom is in the Lords, and there has been some discussion about it because quite a lot of people in the House of Lords would like nothing more than to implement censorship of GB News, and I've been involved in debates on that very question. The thing that really struck me was, why would Ofcom make a particular issue of that one broadcast? It's an important question because they've actually said they could even trigger statutory intervention, as in the government intervening in relation to GB News. In other words, it's a threat of closing down the channel, whichever way you look at it. And this was a programme in which the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was invited to do a Q&A with voters from the United Kingdom, and those voters were selected by not GB News but by an external group, an external body. They weren't vetted, and they asked the Prime Minister questions and he answered them. And I think for Ofcom to have gone to the wall in terms of pushing the GB News on that particular question, it's not a question of it being insulting to GB News, it's insulting to the public. They're basically saying you should not have the Prime Minister talk to the public unmediated on television, because you never know what will happen. The public won't be partial enough, they won't do what you've told them. And their criticism was that what you needed was a presenter to intervene to make sure balance existed, because in other words, the voting public can never be trusted to be fair or say the right thing. So I just thought that was instructive and interesting. Finally, next week we're off on recess. There's rumours swirling all over the place about the fact that there might be an early election. I've got people, if anyone asks me, I have no idea. I'm the last person that anyone is going to have a conversation with about that. But one of the things that does happen all the time is that there's meetings that are not in the chamber, that are behind the scenes with government ministers, where deals are done. That's exactly how the Victims and Prisoners bill has got through. It will happen in relation to the debates around leasehold housing, which I'm going to come back to after recess. I can already know that there's lots of meetings going on. I just wanted to indicate to you that I have criticised those behind the scenes meetings before, but I've actually been involved in some of them now, so I'm going to defend them. But I wanted you to know that sometimes you do get somewhere. I've organised through things I've said in the chamber, organised for both Sex Matters and for Keep Prisons Single Sex, KPSS, 2 different behind the scenes meetings with government ministers and officials. And I think because of what I've said in the chamber, I forced the government to listen and take that seriously. And I have to say that I hope that those meetings made a difference in terms of, for example, the collation of data in terms of sex rather than gender, but also in terms of single sex provision. And if you look at what's been happening with the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre and the fact that a previous employee has won her tribunal against them because she was gender critical, I mention that because I spoke about it at length in a speech in the chamber, and one of the ministers came up to me this morning and said, I didn't know about that Edinburgh rape crisis issue until you said it in your speech. And then I read around about it, and then we were having the meeting with Sex Matters, and so I read more about it. And now you and Sex Matters and KPSS have been completely vindicated. You were right. Single sex service by women, for women, didn't do what it said on the tin. You said that, and we thought you were exaggerating, and you proved that you were right. It's also the case that I am having an off-the-record discussion. Off-the-record, I'm meeting the Minister for Housing this afternoon to talk about leasehold, and she has already told me that she's looked at all my amendments. She wants to go through in detail whether there's anything the government can do. So I now suddenly feel like all grown up. I'm having meetings with ministerial aides and ministers. And it's worth noting as well that the government minister yesterday, after the discussion on IPPs, did say to me, I know that you have been very frustrated that we haven't gone far enough, and I appreciate that. But for once, I can tell you that more people in the government now understand what IPPs are than ever did before, and that all the officials are talking about what can be done, and it might just be that it's cut through. And one of the things that cut through was the media, and I do think that I can take a smidgen of comfort from the fact that, in defiance of people saying that ordinary working people would not have a sense of fairness and they'd all be Daily Mail thoughtless, that I got an article in the Daily Mail. I've made sure the issue was pursued on both GB News and Talk TV, and have done everything and anything that I could to get this out there. But the real credit goes to grassroots campaigners, and that's whether it's on housing, whether it's on sex versus gender, sex registered at birth, or whether it's on leasehold or IPP. Every single time I have responded to grassroots campaigns who've forced me to look again at an issue. I've read about it, I've thought about it, I've spoken about it, and that's what other people have done. And as a consequence of which, a number of these issues are beginning to become nationally discussed. So my heartfelt thanks to the grassroots campaigners, which is, of course, what I always knew as the Academy of Ideas were the heart of democracy. It was never going to be what happens in the Chamber of the Lords. But for those of you who think you're banging your head against the brick wall and what's the point, actually, it's hugely important that grassroots campaigners force people at the heart of Westminster to take their issues seriously, because eventually you cut through.